In late autumn of 1581, Russia's Tsar Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, became the central figure in one of the most infamous episodes in Russian history. According to long-standing accounts, Ivan flew into a violent rage and struck down his own eldest son and heir, mortally wounding him. The image of a grief-stricken father cradling his dying son has been seared into historical memory, not least through Ilya Repin's famous 1885 painting. Yet for centuries people have asked, did Ivan the Terrible really slay his son and heir? And if so, why? It's November 1581 at Ivan's residence in Alexandrov Sloboda, a fortified compound north of Moscow. By this time, Ivan is in his early 50s, a hardened ruler scarred by decades of war and paranoia. His heir, his 27-year-old son, also named Ivan, had been groomed as the Tsarevich, crown prince, and was often at his father's side in matters of state and war. The tension between father and son, however, had been growing. Contemporary accounts hint that their relationship deteriorated during the later years of Ivan's reign, as the Tsar's temper became increasingly mercurial and outright violent. One Russian chronicler, Ivan Timofeyev, noted that quarrels between Ivan and his son were frequent and often turned physical. The Tsar's favorite weapon was a heavy staff designed to inflict pain, but not lethal blows. On November 14, 1851, an argument erupted that would quickly turn deadly. According to several sources, the dispute began when Ivan IV reprimanded his pregnant daughter-in-law Yelena, the Tsarevich's wife, for her attire. She had been resting in informal clothing when Ivan unexpectedly entered her chambers. Seeing her in undress, Ivan the Terrible became enraged at what he perceived as immodesty. In a fury, he struck the young woman very hard. One account by the papal envoy Antonio Passavino describes Ivan hitting his son's wife so brutally with his staff that she later miscarried. Hearing the commotion, Tsarevich Ivan rushed in to protect his pregnant wife. The son's intervention, however, only redirected Ivan's wrath. The Tsar turned on his heir, and in the heat of the altercation, Ivan raised his staff and brought it crashing down on the young man's head. The blow struck near the temple, knocking the Tsarevich to the ground and inflicting a terrible wound. In the immediate aftermath, the rage that possessed Ivan IV seemed to evaporate, replaced by instant remorse. Witnesses would later describe the Tsar cradling his bleeding son and falling into despair. Passavino, the papal envoy, noted in a report to Rome that, quote, having wounded his son, the father immediately gave himself up to deep grief. He frantically summoned doctors and advisors in a desperate attempt to save the Tsarevich's life. Despite these efforts, the young Ivan Ivanovich succumbed to his injury a few days later. Sources indicate the Tsarevich died on November 19, 1581, 5 days after the struggle. The story of Ivan the Terrible slaying his son comes mainly from contemporaries and near-contemporaries who recorded the event. However, it's important to remember that the death of the Tsarevich is, in essence, not part of the direct historical record of the Muscovite state. Notably, the official Muscovite chronicles were largely silent about the cause of the Tsarevich's death. Immediately after the incident, Ivan IV attempted to control the narrative. He sent letters to trusted nobles reporting that his son had fallen gravely ill. He carefully worded the letters to avoid mentioning any altercation, and though he didn't state it directly, the letters strongly implied a natural illness was at work. Indeed, several official Russian chronicles dutifully noted the Tsarevich's death without providing details and certainly without blaming the Tsar. It's telling that none of the sanctioned chronicles suggest a violent cause. This silence was likely due to the unthinkable notion, at least publicly, that the Tsar, who was supposedly divinely ordained, could commit such an evil act. Beneath the surface, however, information leaked out. At least 6 different sources from the period mention the violent quarrel in November 1581 and implicate Ivan IV in his son's death. Ivan Timofeyev, a clerk close to the court, wrote the following. Quote, "Some say that the Tsarevich's life was extinguished by the blow of his father's hand because he wanted to keep his father from some disreputable deed. This 'some say' phrasing suggests Timofeyev was reporting a rumor circulating in Moscow, likely the very truth that officials dared not state openly. Further, the wording is still very cautious, because the act that the Tsarevich was stopping was Ivan slaying his daughter-in-law and grandchild." Foreign observers in Russia provided more detailed testimony. Antonio Posavino, the Jesuit envoy from the Pope, arrived in Moscow in early 1582, just a few months after the tragedy. He found the Russian court deep in mourning for the Tsarevich. In his later published account, Posavino relates the entire grisly story as it was told to him by German Catholic merchants in Moscow. His version includes the scene of the pregnant daughter-in-law assaulted for her attire, and the son bludgeoned while pleading for mercy. Another foreign source, a French mercenary captain, wrote a few years later that the rumor in Moscow was that Ivan did it. The convergence of multiple testimonies all pointing to the same basic story is striking. By all indications, the Tsarevich was not simply terminally ill, as the official line claimed. Rather, he was fatally injured by his father. Despite the wealth of contemporaneous reports, it's important to acknowledge that not every historian has been completely convinced by the traditional story. The primary weakness in the evidence is the lack of any direct, first-hand documentation of the Tsar's guilt in official records. The most detailed account, Posavino's, was published a few years after the fact and was second-hand. In fact, Posavino's own private correspondence indicates he harbored doubts about the tale. Writing to his superiors in Rome, the Jesuit referred to the Tsarevich's death story as a rumor he didn't entirely believe. In other words, skeptics argue that the story might stem from hearsay amplified by Ivan's many enemies, both within Russia and in the West. Over the years, alternative theories have occasionally been floated. One suggestion is that the crown prince could have died of illness, or even been poisoned by political rivals, and that the tale of Ivan striking him was a later invention. However, forensic inquiries have neither confirmed nor disproven such theories. In 1963, Soviet scientists exhumed the remains of the former heir to test the cause of death. Unfortunately, the Tsarevich's skull was too damaged by time and groundwater to yield conclusive evidence of a head injury. Traces of arsenic and mercury were found in the young man's bones, but only in small amounts. Some have suggested the possibility that this was from medicinal treatments, common at the time, not necessarily proof of deliberate poisoning. The forensic study thus didn't contradict the traditional account, rather it simply couldn't provide new proof either way. With physical evidence inconclusive and official chronicles mute, the case hinges on written testimonies and the circumstantial evidence of Ivan's subsequent behavior. Crucially, no credible source has ever presented a wholly different explanation for the Tsarevich's death. Yet the absence of this competent heir after November 1581 is an undeniable historical fact. All narratives, even the skeptical ones, must account for why the strong and healthy heir apparent died so suddenly in his father's residence. The simplest explanation remains the long-accepted one, in essence, a disturbingly in character fit of rage on the Tsar's part. Indeed, historians have uncovered nothing that contradicts the belief that Ivan truly ended his son. The lack of definitive proof doesn't outweigh the convergence of contemporary hearsay that point to the Tsar's guilt. While I believe it's safe to say that based on the evidence we have today, he isn't guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, this isn't how we ought to judge historical cases such as this. Ivan the Terrible was, by all accounts, a man who was very violent on a personal level. While we should be careful with lurid anecdotes, in this case the anecdotes align with each other and with the Tsar's well-known character. Thus, even after considering the counter-arguments, the balance of evidence leans toward the conclusion that Ivan the Terrible did strike the blow that led to his son's death. Further, his subsequent actions were questionable if his son had perished of natural causes, a very common happening at that time. Evidence suggests that Ivan's remorse was not fleeting. More than a year after the incident, in January 1583, Ivan made a pilgrimage to the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery and met privately with two monks seeking spiritual counsel. According to monastery records, the Tsar arrived in despair, weeping and sobbing as he begged for forgiveness and for prayers for his departed son. He donated substantial sums of money and asked that his son be commemorated forever and ever at the monastery. Most have interpreted this as an extraordinary request that implies a deep sense of guilt. Notably, Ivan timed this act of penance to coincide with the Feast of Epiphany, when the Gospel reading calls for repentance. Historians interpret Ivan's behavior at the monastery as what is likely a genuine attempt at atonement. The Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, by most accounts, was a capable young man and one of the few people the cruel Tsar loved. For Ivan to fatally strike this son suggests that during his outburst, the Tsar's capacity for self-control was completely overwhelmed by rage. In the aftermath, faced with what he had done, Ivan's psyche must have been shattered. Some chronicles say that Ivan's health and spirit declined after his son's death. He became increasingly withdrawn and despondent in his final years. He died in 1584, less than 3 years after the incident, having reportedly never regained his vitality. The immediate personal tragedy of the Tsarevich's death had far-reaching consequences for the Russian state. The crown prince was not only Ivan IV's beloved son, he was the Tsar's only viable heir to the throne. By 1581, Ivan the Terrible had already lost 2 older sons in infancy and had 1 younger son, Fedor, who was widely regarded as weak and feeble-minded. In a moment of rage, Ivan effectively destroyed the future of his Rurikid dynasty. For reference, this is a dynasty so old and respected that they could trace their lineage all the way back to Viking Norse conquerors of the Russian frontier. Indeed, when Ivan the Terrible died a few years later, the throne passed to his surviving son, Tsar Fedor. Fedor, however, was an unprepared and ineffective ruler, and real power fell to Fedor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who acted as regent. When Fedor ultimately perished in 1598, Russia fell into a 15-year period called the Times of Trouble, where chaos overwhelmed Russia. And yes, you know when the Russians call it the Times of Trouble, it's real bad news. Thus, Ivan the Terrible's impulsive act of violence against his son set the stage for what became one of the most disturbing and destructive periods in Russian history. This period would only be ended by the ascension of the Romanov dynasty that would rule as autocrats of Russia for the next 3 centuries. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. On the morning of November 23, 1944, British anti-aircraft troops near Kortenberg in Belgium were startled to see a lone B-17 Flying Fortress bomber appearing out of the gray sky. It was heading straight toward them with its landing gear down, causing some concern amongst the British soldiers present. No flights were scheduled, so the soldiers on the ground assumed this heavy American aircraft must be in distress and attempting an emergency landing. The massive 4-engine bomber came in fast and low, overshooting their position and plowing into a nearby field. Its landing was rough and uncontrolled. The B-17's propeller blades snapped off as they struck the earth, and both wings smacked the ground before the fuselage skidded to a halt. Miraculously, the flying fortress did not break apart or burst into flames. It came to rest battered but largely intact, a crash landing in one piece, with 3 of its engines still faintly rumbling on. The astonished RAF crew braced for the bomber's crew to emerge, ready to help any survivors out of the wreck. They waited for over 15 minutes, expecting at any moment to see dazed airmen climbing out of the downed plane, but nobody came out. After some time passed with no apparent movement, Major John Crisp, one of the British officers on site, decided he had to investigate. Major Crisp cautiously approached the silent B-17, unsure what he would find inside. He even worried the abandoned bomber might be some kind of German booby trap or trick, given the unusual circumstance. The airplane's engines were still sputtering, so Crisp clambered onto the fuselage and managed to reach the controls to shut off the throbbing motors. With the roar of the engines dying out, an eerie silence fell. Crisp then found a hatch on the underside of the aircraft, opened it, and pulled himself up into the belly of the bomber. What he discovered upon entering would shock him. There was no one inside, not a single soul. The B-17's interior showed clear signs of recent occupation by a crew, yet the men themselves had vanished. To appreciate just how extraordinary this situation was, one must understand the typical role of a B-17 and its crew in World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a heavy bomber employed by the United States Army Air Forces, used primarily in the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. These stout aircraft, each usually manned by a crew of 10, flew from airfields in England on long-range missions to hit German military and industrial targets. They were capable of striking factories, railway yards, and oil refineries deep behind enemy lines, destroying the infrastructure of the crumbling Third Reich. B-17 crews endured fierce opposition on every sortie. Flying at high altitudes and tight formations, they were met with relentless anti-aircraft fire and increasingly limited swarms of enemy fighters. In the early years of the campaign, before long-range fighter escorts became common, American bomber losses were brutally high. In late 1943, the average B-17 had a life expectancy of only 11 missions, and its crew's odds were no better. Over the course of the war, these flying fortresses dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets, but this came at a great cost in men and machines. Some missions became infamous for their danger. For example, a single 1944 raid on the Mersburg-Leipzig oil complex was defended by 780 flak guns. In an astonishing fact, 56 American bombers were lost on that day alone. It wasn't uncommon for damaged bombers to limp back toward Allied lines, only to have their crews bail out when the aircraft could no longer stay aloft. Normally, however, if a crew had to abandon their B-17, the aircraft would eventually crash and be destroyed. None of the Allied soldiers in Belgium that day had ever seen a flying fortress make it back by itself, which is why the sight of that empty B-17 sitting in a field was so unbelievable. Inside the downed bomber, Major Crisp found plenty of evidence of its crew, but no crew members. Using a flashlight, he carefully moved through the fuselage and the cramped crew compartments. Later, Crisp would report that the most remarkable find was about a dozen parachutes wrapped up and ready to go. Every airman's parachute appeared to be present and packed, which made the absence of the crew even more baffling. If the men had jumped out, why were all their parachutes left on board? On the navigator's desk, Crisp found a code book and noted that the last entry scrawled in it read simply, "Bad flak." Scattered around were personal items, several fur-lined flying jackets, and even some half-eaten food. There were no signs of struggle or of any casualties. In fact, there was no blood and no damage from bullets or flak inside. Aside from the damage inflicted by the crash landing itself, the B-17 appeared surprisingly undamaged. This made the cryptic bad flak note even more puzzling, since whatever trouble the bomber had encountered in the air had left no visible holes or scars on the airframe. By this point, word of the strange crewless aircraft had spread among nearby Allied units. The abandoned flying fortress quickly earned a nickname, the Phantom Fortress. Investigators arrived to identify the ghost bomber and search for an explanation. They soon confirmed the plane's serial number and markings. It belonged to the 91st Bombardment Group, a veteran American unit based in England. The last mission flown by this B-17, before it decided to finish the trip alone, had been a raid on the oil refineries in Mersburg earlier that day. Somewhere between the target and Belgium, something clearly had gone very wrong. The pressing question remained: what happened to the crew? At first, some feared the men might have fallen out or met with a grim end. The untouched parachutes suggested that if anyone had bailed out during the flight, they did so without the very equipment that would have saved their lives. A breakthrough came not long after. Astonishingly, the entire crew was found alive and safe on the ground in Belgium. One by one, the American airmen from the Phantom Fortress were located and brought in by Allied personnel. Their appearance answered the biggest question. The men had parachuted out of the B-17 before it crash-landed, but raised others. According to their report, the B-17 had developed a serious mechanical problem with its bomb rack while en route to the target, which prevented them from dropping their bombs. The pilots veered the plane out of formation to try to resolve the issue, but as they did so, they were hit by enemy fire. Bursting flak from German anti-aircraft weapons further damaged the bomb bay and knocked out at least one of the engines. The flying fortress began losing speed and altitude, unable to stay with the rest of the bomber group. With a crippled engine and possibly structural damage, the pilot set his sights on Allied territory in Belgium. As they crossed into friendly territory not far from Brussels, the pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. Following standard procedure, the pilot engaged the autopilot to hold the plane steady on a level course while the crew prepared to jump. One by one, all the crewmen clipped on their parachutes and bailed out from the struggling fortress at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. They all made it out successfully and their parachutes deployed. The men drifted down to safety and were soon rescued by Allied ground units who spotted them. The B-17, now completely unattended, surprisingly did not nosedive or spiral out of control as many damaged planes would. Instead, with the autopilot still engaged, the bomber continued to fly on its own. It slowly descended in a wide glide, maintaining a generally straight and level altitude. In an incredible twist of fate, the unmanned aircraft happened to come down near where Major Crisp's anti-aircraft unit was positioned. When Major Crisp compared the crew's story to what he found, some details didn't seem to line up neatly. The airmen had described serious flak damage and engine failures, yet the aircraft on the ground showed little evidence of battle damage. Those discrepancies were not unheard of in the chaos of combat. More puzzling was the matter of the parachutes. Crisp had found all those chutes neatly stowed, but the crew obviously had parachuted out. One likely explanation is that the parachutes Crisp found were spares, or crew chute packs that were left on board. Perhaps the crew grabbed different chutes, such as chest pack parachutes that attached to harnesses, and left the rest behind in their haste. It's also conceivable that in the confusion, Crisp tallied more parachutes than were actually standard issue for the crew. Whatever the case, the presence of unused parachutes on the Phantom Fortress has remained one of the quirks of the story. The fact that this B-17 landed itself without a crew was unprecedented and there's no documented cases of it happening since. Some question if the mystery isn't how the plane landed, or the state of the plane and the parachutes, but whether this event happened at all. In my review of the evidence, I think it may be best to classify this one as based on a true story. A flying fortress did land itself in November 1944, and the crew did survive. However, everything else may be subject to embellishments over time, or to make the story more compelling. That said, to repeat a tired line that's overused for a reason, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.